Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's class, our sixth class on Tathagata Essence. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, we sure can.
All right. Okay, let's go ahead and begin as we usually do with just a few prayers. Let me put those on the screen and we'll recite those together. Again, we'll be starting with the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha and recalling all the Buddha's qualities, as well as how the Buddha, as we've seen in this class, is the embodiment of the Dharma jewel at its fullest level, as well as the Sangha jewel. So we're putting our confidence in the Buddha and the Dharma and the Sangha as we recite this praise to the Buddha. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Let's do the short mandala offering. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then refuge in bodhicitta, as usual, we'll do this the first time in English and then twice more in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chanyan Gipe Sonam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupa Sho Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kapsu Chi Daki Chanyan Gipe Sanam Gi Dola Panchir Sangye Druparsho. All right, let's do a short meditation before we begin the class then. So we'll spend the first few minutes just focusing on the breath, trying to develop our concentration as best as we can. And then I'll lead you in setting motivation after that. So I'll ring the bell to begin the meditation. Now, to set our motivation, it would be useful for us to review these 7 vajra topics of this text, because they really inform our motivation of bodhicitta. They inform our practice. And we started with the 3 jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, which in this presentation are the resultant 3 jewels, the state that we want to achieve, our own buddhahood, and by virtue of that, the completion of the Dharma jewel, the fulfillment of the Sangha jewel. In the state of buddhahood, we will become everything we need to be and are capable of being. And we do this not just for ourselves, but for the benefit of all beings. But we see that we need causes to be able to accomplish that. And the main cause, the main topic of this course, is our Buddha nature, our Buddha potential. The fact that we have a mind that is capable of transforming and developing into that state of Buddhahood, because the afflictions and all that contaminates the mind are not there inherently. They can be removed. And this is because of their emptiness and also because of the emptiness of the mind, the clear light nature of the mind. We can attain that state because we have the raw material from which Buddhahood develops. But then we see also, as we explored briefly last week, that we need these other cooperative conditions. We need to rely upon those who have gone before us, who have attained enlightenment themselves, that they are imbued with qualities such as the 10 powers, the 18 unshared qualities, the 4 fearlessnesses, immeasurable qualities of these enlightened beings who have accomplished that goal and are engaged in enlightened activities to help us to do the same. The enlightened activities are primarily the teaching of the Dharma. So when we think in particular about Buddha Shakyamuni, this great enlightened being, the supreme emanation body who appeared in this world, complete with all his qualities, and turned the wheel of Dharma, gave us these teachings that we're studying now and that we have been studying in our life. We need those cooperative conditions. We need to rely upon that to help us to develop our own Buddha nature into the resultant 3 jewels. This is what bodhicitta is based on entirely, is that we ourselves have the potential to become a Buddha, but moreover that all beings possess that same potential. Therefore, we become a Buddha so we can lead others to that state, and we generate that motivation right now, so that everything we do tonight becomes a cause for that result, our own enlightenment. So we then can engage in the enlightened activities of benefiting others, bringing them the Dharma that will help them to actualize their own potential as well. Okay. So again, welcome to the 6th class. I'm very excited because tonight we actually get into the heart of the subject matter. We'll get into Buddha nature tonight. So let me go forward. I think I will just reserve questions for the end if possible. Hopefully have a little bit of time at the end. If you do have some questions from last week, then please let me know later when I ask for questions, but write them down if you're afraid you'll forget them. So what I'd like to do to get things started, I didn't go through this passage. This is at the very tail end of what we covered last week. I think it's page 85 of the commentary. Remember, we were going through these verses, numbers 23 through 26, I think, were the last few verses that we went through. And they were talking about the remaining vajra points that were going to be covered in the text and kind of the difficulties in ascertaining some of these very profound subjects within this. So what I wanted to do is just go through this paragraph that's on the screen. So the above, everything that we just went through again in the last class, we did cover a little bit about kind of wrapping up the three jewels, but this was the latter part of the class. The above is an identification of the four vajra-like points. We covered those in essentially verse 23a and b. So put them on the screen here. Suchness with stains, that's again our Buddha nature. Enlightenment without stains, that's the fifth of the Vajra topics, and the enlightenment of others that we are depending upon. Then the undefiled excellent qualities of the Buddha, the qualities that they possess, such as again the 18 unshared qualities and so on. And then the deeds, the enlightened activities of the conqueror. So those were introduced in that verse 23 in the first two lines. Then an ascertainment of which consciousnesses apprehend them as objects, which consciousnesses know them fully. And we're developing our own understanding of it, but it's all still very conceptual and not necessarily as profound or deep as the Buddhas who know these topics more profoundly. So that was in the remaining two lines of verse 23. Those causes and conditions, because again, these are the causes and conditions for us to be able to actualize the three jewels in our own continuum, from which the three virtuous jewels arise, are the objects of those who realize the ultimate. The three jewels and its lineage are objects only of those all-seeing ones. So essentially, these kind of the full knowledge of all of this isn't really under our sort of purview. It's only the minds of a Buddha that will understand them to that degree. So that was the second point that's raised here, an ascertainment of which consciousnesses apprehend them as objects. That was the last two lines of 23 and the first two lines of 24. Then the reasons why they are difficult to comprehend. This goes back to, again, that we went through this, the four reasons, these four aspects that are mentioned in the second part of 24 and then verse 25. These four aspects in their respective order are inconceivable by way of four reasons. That because the basic element is pure, yet has afflictions, we went through these last time, I'm not going to describe them all again. Because enlightenment is thoroughly without afflictions, yet is still to be purified. Because the excellent qualities are undifferentiable in their suchness, and because the deeds are spontaneous and non-conceptual. These are hard for us to fathom because, again, we can see the suchness, the undefiled, the natural purity of our Buddha nature, but yet there's still defilement. The fact that when you've attained that purity of adventitious afflictions and stains, you still had to accomplish that, even though there was natural purity there, and so on. We looked at these last week. So this gets into kind of some very profound elements of this text that we're studying. Again, we're not going to go into all of the remaining four Vajra points. We're only doing the first of those, the Buddha nature, the Tathagata essence. Then the final topic that we talked about at the end of last week, if they are comprehended, how they become causes and conditions for peerless enlightenment. So that was verse 26. Let me move it up just a little bit here. The basic element that is to be realized, the realization, the branches of the excellent qualities of the Buddha, and the deeds that are for the sake of realization in this order of four. The first point is the cause, the other three are conditions for purification. So when we do realize them, we realize them in that manner. But again, as I mentioned in the meditation tonight, Buddha nature is the substantial cause from which our enlightenment will develop. And again, we talk about naturally abiding lineage or Buddha nature and developmental Buddha nature. The developmental Buddha nature becomes the Dharmakaya, the truth body, wisdom truth body. The emptiness of the mind, the naturally abiding Buddha nature, is the emptiness of the Buddha's mind when it is transformed. Our mind has been transformed into that. That's the raw stuff from which enlightenment is formed. But we need those three assisting causes. We need the enlightenment of others, other enlightened beings who help us on our path, who point the Dharma out to us, just like the Buddha pointing at the moon, right? Just giving us the way to get there. And then we need the enlightened qualities that they possess, otherwise they wouldn't be qualified guides for us. And then we need their enlightened activities, which is kind of going to be the beginning point for what we're going to look at in this very next section when we go into the natural, or into the Buddha nature, Buddha lineage, all right? So that was to give you a little bit of an introduction into, or a review of what we're doing. Now we want to do a sort of introduction into what we're going to be doing tonight. Let me pull up the text. Again, we're on page 86. You'll notice that this starts chapter 4, an explanation of the basic element of Tathagata essence. Again, I mentioned how you have all these different synonyms for this. You have basic element, Buddha nature, Buddha potential, Tathagata essence. All of these are pointing to the same thing. The mind that we possess that has the ability to develop into a Buddha, and the emptiness of that mind, the suchness of that mind. And I don't know if I really mentioned it directly last week, but this word suchness, we were kind of using it because the text was using it. Suchness, thusness, emptiness, selflessness, these are all synonyms of this negation of a way of existing that we call emptiness. Suchness is meaning this, it is such, it is this way, or it is thusness. So again, it's just pointing to the way that things abide without any inherent existence. So what we see from here in the text on the very top of the screen, you'll see that it says the causal phase, an explanation of the basic element of Tathagata essence. This is the remainder of what we're going to study in this course. Then we have an explanation of enlightenment and so forth. Those were, again, the last 3 of the 7 vajra points. Then we have in the causal phase, there's going to be a little link that gets us into this topic. And there's a general link and a specific link. Let me just go ahead and read these. I think they're pretty straightforward. From here on, the remainder of the text extensively explains in sequence these 4 bases. Again, the 4th through the 7th vajra points. The commentary states, with reference to suchness with defilement, which is the way that we've been referring to Buddha nature, it's the emptiness of the mind that is still with defilement, not that the suchness is defiled. The suchness of the mind is there in the midst of it being, the mind being defiled. A sutra says, all sentient beings possess the Tathagata essence. What are the reasons for this statement? What is its purpose? The link, therefore, is provided by these questions. Here, the Tathagata essence is mentioned in this link, clearly refers solely to its causal phase. Therefore, this point's come up before, applying it to the ultimate Dharmakaya is not the intent of the root text and commentary. Once more, this term Tathagata or Tathagata essence refers to Buddha nature, the potential that sentient beings have. Suchness with defilement. Suchness without defilement, the Dharmakaya, is not what the Tathagata essence refers to. So we're only talking about it in the causal phase. Once the result is there of complete enlightenment and the Dharmakaya is manifest, and we no longer have that term. Whoops, sorry. Wait, so So let's go ahead and go down to the rest of this explanation that provides the link. Further on in the text, the purpose of teaching the basic element is again raised separately in the form of a question. This actually, comes up later when we talk about the purpose of the text. It's just going to be at the very end, the purpose of teaching Buddha nature or Tathagata essence. It says, but this link also asks the questions, what is the meaning of the term Tathagata essence? What is the purpose of teaching its presence in all beings? So we're really getting down to the initial verse 27 and then 28, which explains it a little bit, is kind of getting at this idea of how can we assert that Buddha nature exists in all beings? What are the reasons why we can hold to that? So this gets into a subtopic here of the Tathagata essence, kind of an introduction to this topic that is, again, is what we're going to be exploring in the remainder of this course. First of all, we have the Tathagata essence briefly explained by 3 points. Then we get into its establishment through an extensive explanation. And then again, that section I mentioned, the purpose of teaching that sentient beings possess the basic element. That'll be at the tail end of what we discuss in this course many weeks from now. So on page 87, we then have the Tathagata essence briefly explained by 3 points. And we see that there's going to be a general explanation and then the meaning of each section. General explanation goes into how we recognize the Tathagata essence through establishing these 3 points or 3 reasons. So we don't get the verse right off the bat. We're going to get a little bit of an explanation here. So we're going to do this first, and then I'm going to introduce you to the verses and do a little bit of a additional commentary from Geshe Loden on this verse 27. Verse 27 is used it in many, many places to kind of establish why Buddha nature exists in all beings. So we're going to have this set out again in Gyaltsabje's commentary first. He says, Tathagata essence is illustrated in three ways. First, by the effect, the result, of the resultant Tathagata, by the nature of the Tathagata, secondly, and from the point of view of it being the cause of the Tathagata. Don't worry, sounds like I'm going fast. You get a repeat of these points again and again. You're going to see them in verse 27. You're even going to see them in the beginning of what we call the 10 presentations that we're going to start tonight. So he goes on to say, it is explained this way, and not merely by suchness or by positing the Dharmakaya of a perfect Buddha as Tathagata essence, which again is not the intent. This is because this treatise, in its root text and commentary, explains Tathagata essence as pertaining solely to sentient beings and to the causal phase. So even though we're going to talk about it through discussing the effect of the resultant Tathagata, it's not referring to, Tathagata essence isn't referring to that. It's referring to the potential that all beings have to develop into that. And the nature of the Tathagata, the naturally abiding nature, the natural purity, and then of course, from the point of view of the development of the mind into that state. So that's what we're essentially going to be talking about. But as I said, don't worry, we're getting into this in much more detail as we go through this. These three can be illustrated, he says. Meditating on the path of utilizing the basic element results in the attainment of the Dharmakaya of a perfect Buddha, whose enlightened activities emanate and pervade to all sentient beings. These enlightened activities of the Dharmakaya are capable of engaging with sentient beings and exist exclusively for the mind streams of sentient beings. Because of this, it is said that all sentient beings possess Tathagata essence. This is similar in meaning to the Abhisamayalankara when it says, because enlightened activities are vast, it is said that the Buddha is all pervasive, as it is missing from that first bit. So this is the very first point. Let me take it off screen for a moment and discuss it. When we say that Tathagata essence is being referred to, or kind of a reason for it is the Tathagatas themselves, the resultant state of the Dharmakaya that exists, we mean that essentially, kind of there's two aspects to it. One is that those beings themselves who have accomplished that goal, who have become Buddhas, are engaged in enlightened activities that pervade the minds of all beings. And we often use the example, and I think this is coming up a little later in our text, that the Buddhas are like the sun shining. The sun is shining indiscriminately at all times. It's sending the light rays out to bring light to all realms of the surrounding area. It's not making a choice, oh, I won't shine today or only shine on this part of the world or what have you. Instead, it's up to the minds of sentient beings to be able to engage in that. But all sentient beings' minds are subject to the enlightened activities of the Buddhas. That goes into then the kind of objective element of it, the fact that then sentient beings from their side use those enlightened activities and the teachings of the Buddha to develop their own minds into that state. It's kind of like the circle of Buddhahood. you have people who became a Buddha so they can bring other beings to that state of Buddhahood, so then they can become a Buddha and help bring other beings to that state, so that eventually all beings will achieve their greatest potential. So I'm going to go through something after we go through this initial part that will explain this from Geshe Loden's words that kind of talk to both of those elements of it. But essentially, we are talking about how beings have the ability to achieve the resultant state through experiencing the enlightened activities of those who have already done that work. This proves in some capacity that the Buddha nature exists in all beings. The second of these three topics that we're looking at, suchness, emptiness, by its nature, is divorced from defilement and is the nature of both Buddhas and sentient beings, as well as, of course, their minds. The emptiness of a Buddha's mind is no different than the emptiness of your mind. The emptiness of your mind when you become a Buddha is the same. The only difference is the adventitious defilements have been removed. What has stained the mind, suchness with defilement that we have currently, is no longer, that defilement is no longer there. So he goes, therefore, by nature, it is divorced from defilement and becomes suchness with stains in the continuum of a sentient being. This is present in all sentient beings and is the thinking behind the statement that all sentient beings possess Tathagata essence. Okay. So let's take it off screen here and let me explain that second point just a little bit more. When we talk about this second point, we are talking essentially about naturally abiding Buddha nature. That the suchness of our own minds right now that are together with stains is absolutely no different, indifferentiable from the suchness of a Buddha's mind. Now, is the mind of a Buddha indifferentiable from the mind of a sentient being who's got affliction? Absolutely not. They are differentiable because we've got stains, filling up the minds of sentient beings who are together with the affliction still. And then you have the Buddhas who have removed all the afflictive obscurations, the knowledge obscurations, everything that defiles the mind. So the mind has changed, but the suchness doesn't change at all. Suchness is the same suchness, the same emptiness of the being who is with stains and the being who is without. This is kind of proving again through the natural purity of both of these minds that we all possess Tathagata essence because we all have minds who are in the same fundamental nature. Now we're again right about at the center of that paragraph where it says the lineage of the Buddha, in other words, Buddha nature, Buddha lineage, is present during the causal phase and brings about the attainment of the three enlightened bodies. By three enlightened bodies, we're primarily here talking about the wisdom truth body and the two form bodies, the two rupakaya, the sambhogakaya, which is the complete enjoyment body, and the nirmanakaya, the emanation body. So this, he goes on to say, this is present in all beings, and this too is the thinking behind the statement that all sentient beings possess Tathagata essence. It is true that lineage also refers to the naturally abiding lineage. But when using the existence of the lineage to explain the presence of the Tathagata essence, it is explained from the point of view of being a cause of the Tathagata, meaning a real cause of the Tathagata. We often say naturally abiding lineage is also a cause, but it's only a nominal cause because it is a permanent phenomenon. It's an unchanging phenomenon. It can't be a cause. Let me finish this paragraph and then I'll explain that a little further. When using the existence of suchness as a reason, it is explained from the point of view of being of the nature of the Tathagata. In other words, it's kind of referring to the second reason that I just went through. So this third reason is essentially saying we all have minds that can develop into the three form bodies of a Buddha. I'm sorry, the three bodies of a Buddha, the two form bodies and the wisdom truth body. We have a mind right now that is with stains. As we go through the enlightened activities of the Buddha, we go through a process of changing our minds, developing our minds, achieving realizations along the path. All of this will purify the mind, and eventually we will attain that state of Buddhahood. This is the nature of our minds. We talked about that example of like the acorn that Venerable Rabino often uses, right? That the nature of the acorn in terms of its potential is to be an oak tree. While you can use the acorn for many different things, it will not achieve its potential until it's put in the ground. All the causes and conditions are given to it so that it can grow and develop into an oak tree. That's the potential of the acorn. The potential of our own minds is this developing potential, the ability for us to achieve enlightenment through going through this transformative process. So now what we've talked about then is 3 points. One, all beings are pervaded by the enlightened activities of the Buddhas because they possess this ability to kind of use that to develop their own minds on the path. But this is kind of acknowledging that we depend upon the resultant states of other beings, them achieving enlightenment that act through their enlightened activities to influence all sentient beings. In fact, they say every virtue that exists or has ever existed exists through the power of the Buddhas. Okay. Kind of an interesting thought to contemplate. Then we have, secondly, the fact that there's no differentiation in suchness between the mind of a Buddha and the mind of a sentient being, nor of any phenomena for that matter. But we're highlighting the mind here because it's the mind and the third reason that develops from an unenlightened state to an enlightened state. These are the three reasons that prove that every sentient being has Buddha nature and has the potential, therefore, to develop into a Tathagata, into a being who has gone to that state of thusness. Whoops, just a little too far. Therefore, the potential of the continuum of sentient beings to engage with the Dharmakaya enlightened activities. That's the first one. The presence of suchness with stains within the continuum of sentient beings. It again is identical to the suchness of a Buddha. And the potential of transformation into the three enlightened bodies within the continuum of sentient beings are the three Buddha lineages. These three are the Tathagata essence so expertly ascertained by the Tathagata Essence Sutra and by this treatise in root and commentary form. The way that such an ascertainment is arranged in the graduated path will be explained in the chapter on benefits. So again, this is just essentially saying that we have these three aspects of it. Keep in mind, these three aspects are going to be reintroduced as we go through this text. We're going to see them in verse 27, but we're going to see them again in terms of even 9 similes. We're going to see them in terms of the beginning of the 10 presentations. What I'd like to do now is just to review this because I think it's helpful. Kind of maybe we're beating these points to death, but at the same time, it'll be useful for us to be able to make sure that they hit home and that we know what we're talking about, especially with this very important verse 27. The first, again, several slides for this were in your slide package for last week. I didn't get around to covering them, obviously. This is from Geshe Loden's book, which I have here. I think you can find used copies on the internet somewhere. It's actually very nice for what we're studying the remainder of this course. But it's also talking about Buddha nature from a couple of other vantage points. This verse from the Sublime Continuum makes reference to the assertion made in the Tathagata Essence Sutra. All embodied beings are ever endowed with the Tathagata essence. We saw that in our commentary, right? And shows how this proposition is established through the following set of 3 valid reasonings. First, all embodied beings are ever endowed with the Tathagata essence or Buddha potential. Why? Because the truth body's influencing activities pervade all living beings. The definition of the wisdom truth body's influencing activities is the pure qualities arising from the dominant condition of the wisdom truth body, which is their cause. So we have the Dharmakaya, the Jnana Dharmakaya, the wisdom truth body that is kind of the root from which all of this happens. That's the fully enlightened mind of a Buddha that then engages in enlightened activities through being imbued with this great compassion for all beings and appearing in form bodies for their sake and what have you. The wisdom truth bodies influencing activities are of 2 types. I alluded to this earlier when I went through the commentary. One, influencing activities possessed by the subject, the Dharmakaya, the Buddha themselves. And second, influencing activities possessed by the object. All the Buddha's qualities, the 10 powers and so on, are considered as activities possessed by the subject because all of those are continually there, being the source of the Buddha's teachings and so on. Sentient beings' virtuous minds are considered as activities possessed by the object. The virtuous qualities of living beings, love, compassion, wisdom, and so on, are considered as being the influencing activity of the Buddha's wisdom truth body. So all beings, in another way of kind of looking at this, is like all beings are there with a sort of seed that can develop into the same state of Buddhahood that these enlightened beings have developed into. So there's like that receptivity that is there just by virtue of having a mind that is defiled, but is empty of any sort of advent or any natural stain, has natural purity, has emptiness. So it's kind of like we are perfect receptacles for the Buddhist teachings. The Buddhist teachings exist just for one purpose, to help sentient beings like ourselves to become enlightened. And we're the perfect receptacles for receiving those teachings. We've got the ability to take those teachings and become just like the beings who are giving us those teachings, right? Okay, that was the first reason. Second, all embodied beings are ever endowed. These are, by the way, those of you who know this term, syllogisms, these are being set out as syllogisms, right? The subject, all embodied beings, the predicate, are ever endowed with the Tathagata essence, and then the reason, the sign. Why? Because there is no difference in entity between the emptiness of a Buddha's mind and the emptiness of sentient beings' minds. Their emptiness or suchness or ultimate nature is one indivisible entity. this kind of, again, the underlying reason why enlightenment is possible is because there's no difference in the ultimate nature of our own minds and the minds of a Buddha. We're the same stuff of which Buddhahood is built, in terms of ultimate nature, but also in terms of even our conventional nature. That's because of the third reason. All embodied beings are ever endowed with the Tathagata essence. Why? Because Buddha potential pervades all sentient beings. This is established because all living beings have some degree of virtuous minds, such as the 11 virtuous secondary minds, faith, non-attachment, and so on. These are the mental factors that he's referring to. Many of you have studied that topic, the 11 virtuous mental factors. Because virtuous minds are defined as developed potential, it can be said that all living beings have Buddha potential. Further, all living beings' virtuous minds are empty of inherent existence, and this emptiness is defined as the natural potential. Natural potential, therefore, also pervades all beings. So remember in our text, it said that although you can say that that's true, in general, when we talk about the natural potential or the naturally abiding Buddha nature, that's referring to the emptiness of the mind. And that was discussed in the second point, right? That the emptiness of our minds with stains is the same as the emptiness of the mind of a Buddha without stains. This third point is really emphasizing developed potential or developing transformative potential, the ability of our minds to transform. That's the conventional nature. And they're both part and parcel of becoming a Buddha. You can't have one without the other. Just like you can't have dependent arising without emptiness. These two exist in tandem together. So let's go ahead and continue on with the text, and we'll go through a little bit more, and then I'll hopefully you'll have a better. Oops, I'm sorry, that's not what I wanted to pull up. I just pulled that up before. Let's get back to the text. Here it is. Okay. So let's go on to page 88. And it says here, not to understand the above and to divide Tathagata essence into resultant Tathagata essence, nature, and causal Tathagata essence, thereby ignorantly asserting ultimate Dharmakaya to be the Tathagata essence explained here, is an astonishing assertion and is not the intention of this root treatise on the commentary. Open your eyes and look. This is just, I mentioned this previously. He's going to come back to this at times and say, Tathagata essence is not referring to the resultant Dharmakaya. Here, it's being talked about as one of the aspects of and reasons for Tathagata essence pervading all beings, but it's only from the vantage point of that we are receptive to the enlightened activities of those beings, and we have the potential to develop ourselves to that state. So then he goes on to conclude that section saying, enlightened activities defined by those that bring about the existence of higher realms have engaged with all sentient beings. Therefore, there is not a single sentient being who has not achieved the levels of gods and humans. All sentient beings have the potential to engage with enlightened activities defined by those that bring about nirvana. So again, we have kind of two things that are being mentioned here. Enlightened activities defined by those that bring about the existence of higher realms. That's in the first line. That's what we call high status, right? And I mentioned that previously. That's one aim of the Buddha's teachings, is to get us to states that are favorable, where we don't suffer so much, but also we have an ability to use our lives with great purpose and meaning. This is such as this perfect human rebirth. But then it also talks about enlightened activities defined by those that bring about nirvana, whether we talk about nirvana that is the solitary peace or non-abiding nirvana, which is buddhahood. Those are what we call definite goodness. That's the other aim of the Buddha's teachings. Those are the two main aims. All the Buddha's teachings exist to accomplish those for sentient beings, high status or definite goodness, or both. Essentially, the final goal, of course, is definite goodness, and specifically, non-abiding nirvana, buddhahood. Now, again, I usually am avoiding these sections that have to do with sutras, but I'm going to do a little bit of this section at least because I think it is worthwhile because of some of the topics that are being discussed here, because it's already pointing to what we're going to be looking at right after the initial introduction. So the Tathagata Essence Sutra says, sons of the family, within a lotus of four color, the Tathagata manifests the form of the Tathagata in vajra position, in that seating posture. Lotus or vajra posture, it's sometimes called, radiating 100,000 rays of light. This is already referring to one of the 9 similes of a Buddha that is abiding within a kind of discolored lotus, a sort of decaying, rotten lotus. Using this manifestation of the Tathagata as an analogy, it continues. Within those sentient beings afflicted by every mental affliction is the nature of the Tathagata, unmoving and untainted by the sentient beings of samsara. Seeing this, goes on. So those are the sutra passages that kind of go back to kind of giving us this feeling for what we're going to be looking at. Buddha nature, Tathagata essence, that we have this kind of pure nature within that right now is defiled by stains, but those can be removed. So then he says, and so on, teaching the Tathagata essence extensively by way of 9 similes. The 9 similes are coming up sometime down the road. We're going to look at them in verses 96, the last 2 lines of 96, all the way through verse 153. It's one of the most poetic and beautiful parts of this text. As you can see, this text is rich with similes and analogies and ways of looking at things that really can inspire our minds. So he says, then, this is ascertained in great detail in this treatise by way of the 9 similes of obscured phenomena and their meanings, and 9 similes of obscuring phenomena and their meanings. So there's always in the 9 similes something that is obscured and something that is obscuring it. And we'll get into that when we get to that section. Although in its literal meaning, the Tathagata Essence Sutra is not so clear, you should hold its meaning to be the same as the meaning extensively ascertained in this treatise, by way of the 10 presentations which are taught in detail in the Srimala Devi Sutra. The 10 presentations is the other main body of this. I pointed these 2 out earlier when we went through the table of contents some weeks ago. But that's what we're going to go into next. That's from verse 29 all the way through the first 2 lines of verse 96. 10 presentations are going to establish one element of looking at Buddha nature, and the 9 similes another. We'll get to that in a moment. So the extensive, intermediate, and short Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, the Prajnaparamita, everyone remember what wheel turning that was in? Prajnaparamita Sutra. Stephen has his 2 fingers up, so yes, it's in the second wheel turning. Remember I went through that some weeks ago. They teach literally and forcefully that all phenomena ranging from form to omniscience, these are all the phenomena that are categorized. There's 108 phenomena. I don't remember the exact number of afflicted, and thoroughly purified. But anyway, omniscience is the final one. That is the 108. These are empty by nature. Everything that exists is empty by nature and divorced from all elaborations of true existence. In its meaning, the Tathagata Essence Sutra from the 3rd turning is similar when it stresses the fact that the minds of sentient beings are empty by nature and therefore pure by nature, and that the obscuring defilements are adventitious. Kind of have, again, these 2 elements that we're looking at. The fact that the mind by its very nature is empty and the afflictions themselves are adventitious. They can be removed. They point to the same fact that emptiness exists, and because of emptiness existing, therefore the mind can be transformed and these delusions can be gotten rid of because they're all rooted in ignorance. But essentially, this is kind of what is being taught in this sutra, Tathagata Essence Sutra, which is what we're exploring in this text on Buddha nature. Now, again, what he's going to say essentially is that that's really an extension of the Prajnaparamita then. There's no difference in the way emptiness is taught in what we're looking at versus how it is taught in those sutras. So it says here, this treatise, which unerringly comments on the thinking of the Tathagata Essence Sutra assertion, says, afflictions extinct since the beginning, defilements are adventitious. They have an empty nature from the beginning, and they're there adventitiously, thereby teaching that the afflictions and afflicted conceptions are empty by nature. Similarly, this adventitious nature of the defilements, in the way in which it is taught in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, establishes that the mind is empty of any true existence. Therefore, even the Tathagata Essence Sutra should be recognized as being ultimately a definitive sutra, just like the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. So recall, when I went through the 3 wheel turnings, we talked about the first wheel turning, the 4 Noble Truths, and how this is not a point where the Buddha really taught emptiness in any great detail. It's in the Prajnaparamita in the second wheel turning, where he taught emptiness in the fully perfected form. But then in the 3rd wheel turning, he taught another variety of emptiness that is held by the mind-only school, but only as a stepping stone to get someone who's not quite ready for the second wheel turning to get to that. In the third wheel turning, he also taught the Tathagata Essence Sutra and taught Buddha nature. But the point that's being made here is the way emptiness or Buddha nature is taught in this third wheel turning is identical to, in terms of how emptiness is approached, to what's taught in the Prajnaparamita. So we can call it definitive in the same way that the Prajnaparamita are definitive. Definitive for the middle way school, specifically the consequence middle way school for Sangha Madhyamaka. Definitive sutras are those that teach ultimate truth. Interpretable or provisional sutras are those that teach anything else. So everything else the Buddha taught, whether he was teaching about rebirth or whether he was teaching about the perfections, generosity, and so on, all these other practices, everything else that is not about ultimate truth is provisional. Why? Because it's not being presented in terms of its final nature. Its ultimate nature is emptiness. The ultimate nature of everything is emptiness. So when he's teaching the Tathagata Essence Sutra, because he's teaching Buddha nature from the point of view of emptiness of inherent existence, it's meant to be definitive. It's as definitive as the Prajnaparamita Sutras. So it's an interesting point, even though we often think about the third wheel turning in general as being provisional, as not being the definitive teachings. All right. Now we're going to skip a little bit because I didn't want to go through all of this on the sutras because I think it gets into just kind of a lot more to explain. And frankly, I think we're going to end up using a lot more time than what we would need to. Let's go forward now to page 91 of your commentary, where we get into the meaning of this, kind of looking at the root verses that we're going to be using for the remainder of this little section. Verse 27, as I mentioned, is one of the most famous verses from this whole text. Because the activities of the Dharmakaya are pervasive, sound familiar? Because suchness is undifferentiable, that should sound familiar too. And because of having the lineage, all sentient beings always have the Buddha essence, the Tathagata essence. Then in 28, it explains this just a little further. It says, because the exalted wisdom of a Buddha abides in the multitudes of sentient beings. Again, because those enlightened activities, we're the perfect receptacle again for it. We can receive those teachings and act upon them because we have minds that are subject to their influence. Secondly, because the undefiled nature is non-dual. Final nature of our minds is the emptiness of those minds. The emptiness of those minds, again, is undifferentiable from the emptiness of a Buddha's mind. And then thirdly, the third line, and because Buddha essence is labeled Buddha, the name of its result, because we have this thing that can transform, just like the acorn can transform into the oak tree, the mind that we possess as a sentient being can transform into the mind of a Buddha. It is said that all living beings are endowed with Buddha essence. So these are the same three reasons that we've been looking at, just presented more formally by Maitreya in those root verses. Let's look at Gyaltsabje's commentary. As it says in the Tathagata Essence Sutra, all embodied beings, meaning all sentient beings. This is all sentient beings without exception. That's why we generate bodhicitta with that same mind, right? That we're going to bring all sentient beings without exception to Buddhahood. Why? Because every one of them, no matter how stained their minds are, no matter how much they've engaged in negativity, their minds are still fundamentally pure and can be developed into Buddhahood. They are all constantly endowed with the essence of Buddha, Gyaltsabje says. This means the following. One, because the enlightened activities of the Dharmakaya of a perfect Buddha emanate to all sentient beings are capable of engaging with the enlightened activities of the Tathagatas. Two, because suchness by its nature is undifferentiated in both Tathagatas and sentient beings, suchness with stains, which is what natural abiding Buddha nature is, exists in all sentient beings. We all have a mind that is empty of inherent existence, empty of any natural stains, but does possess adventitious stain. On this basis, this is the third point, it is said that all sentient beings are endowed with Tathagata essence. All beings are endowed with the natural lineage that is capable of transformation into the Dharmakaya, and all sentient beings are endowed with the lineage arising from correct adoption, which is their name for developmental lineage, which is capable of transformation into the enlightened form bodies, and of course also into the wisdom Dharmakaya. On this basis also, it is said that all sentient beings are endowed with Tathagata essence. Therefore, the Tathagata essence has been taught on the basis of 3 points: the capabilities of the enlightened activities of the Tathagatas, its nature, and its causal phase. So again, the resultant state that have the Buddhas that are already in that realm of enlightenment, that are sending out their enlightened activities perpetually, spontaneously, that we are receiving, capable of receiving, the nature of our own minds being in its fundamental state of emptiness, and the causal nature of our minds that can develop into Buddhahood. What is the difference between natural lineage and the suchness with stains that exists within the continuum of sentient beings? There's no difference at all in meaning. They are just different presentations, right? You know, this is how we refer to it. We can say suchness with stains. That's the emptiness of the mind with stains. And we can say natural lineage. We're referring to the same thing, the emptiness of a sentient being's mind that is still polluted with defilement. It goes on to say, one presentation is from the point of view of its causal phase, capable of transformation into the Dharmakaya, which would be, again, the fact that we have that natural lineage. And the other is from the point of view of its nature being one with the nature of the Tathagata, which is the fact that we have this suchness that is there with stains. And the suchness is the same as the suchness without stains that a Buddha has. So then to continue this, to summarize, because of 3 points that explain meaning and purpose, the Tathagata Essence Sutra states that all sentient beings are constantly endowed with the Tathagata essence. These 3 points are, we're going to get them again and again, like they said. Hopefully by the end of this, you'll have them down. The enlightened activities of the Dharmakaya of the Tathagatas are capable of engaging with sentient beings. Suchness with stains from the point of view of its nature is not differentiable from the suchness of the Tathagatas. And thirdly, being endowed with the lineage of the Tathagatas, the mind that can transform into them, the developmental lineage. In the section on the 9 similes, which again comes later, which follows the Tathagata Essence Sutra, these 3 points are also taught by the lines. Having 3 natures, this threefold nature, the basic element is similar to the Buddha and so forth and the Dharma. So again, we'll see this resurface when we look at the 9 similes. Some of them are applicable to the Tathagata, the Dharmakaya, I'm sorry, and some are applicable to the nature, and some are applicable to the cause, the developmental lineage. The ascertaining of the basic element, the Buddha nature, by the 10 presentations may not concur with the literal meaning of the Tathagata Sutra, but the oral tradition says that if it is examined well, the meaning is there. Literally, the sutra clearly establishes the basic element by the 9 similes. Okay, so now we're about to get into the 10 presentations, but before we do this, I wanted to go ahead and just share a little bit more from this, the slides that I put together for tonight. Okay, so if you haven't gotten the point yet, here's Geshe Thupten Choni, the wonderful abbot at Kopan Monastery currently, who says, to summarize, we possess Buddha nature. Why? Because 1, we are suitable receptacles, and the Buddha's enlightened activities can emanate to us. 2, the entity or nature of our mind and the Buddha's mind are the same insofar as they are empty of inherent existence. From the perspective of the entity of the mind, we possess Buddha nature, again, naturally abiding Buddha nature, Buddha lineage. 3, we possess Buddha nature. Why? Because of the existence of its cause in the form of the Buddha lineages. Again, primarily the developmental lineage being spoken there, but we can also include the naturally abiding lineage, which doesn't actually transform per se, because again, the emptiness of a mind is a permanent phenomenon, an unchanging phenomenon. I found this little passage in this nice little book that again is available out there somewhere if you want to try to find one. It's very, very brief. The explanations on the 10 presentations and so on are very succinct. But it's quite a nice little book by Geshe Sonam Rinchen. Many of you know his name, taught at the Tibetan Institute of Dialectics in Dharamsala. But anyway, he's written a number of books for Snowline publications. It's got a nice little passage on this that I think is worth sharing because it gets into this whole idea of kind of these 2 levels, if you will, of what we call clear light mind. The conventional nature of the mind is its clarity and cognizance, right? We talk about mind as clear and knowing. That's how we refer to mind in conventional terms. That's our definition of mind. The stains are not an integral part even of the mind's conventional nature. We're not saying again that our minds are already pure. Our minds are like that glass of water. Remember, I use that example frequently. It has dirt in it. Water in its nature is clear, right? We see water existing in nature with that natural purity. It becomes polluted by virtue of other things entering into it that are not an integral part of the water. Is there a difference, he says, between saying that the mind is not affected by stains and saying the nature of the mind is not affected by stains? I think there is. He goes on to say, at present, our minds are definitely affected by stains. There's dirt in the water, folks. We have to admit it, namely by the disturbing emotions and their imprints. However, if the nature of the mind were affected by these stains, not the mind itself, but the nature of the mind, even the conventional nature of the mind were affected by these stains, we would never be able to get rid of them by applying their emptiness. The water would never be able to be purified. Once you put the dirt in the water, it would be polluted forever. Well, we know that that's not the case, right? Because we're dependent upon a purification process for our drinking water these days, right? You can't go out into nature and get all of your water from natural springs that are, completely healthy and purified. We need to have an ability to purify that, and that's possible because the nature of water is to be clear and pure, just like the nature of our minds is to be that. For instance, if anger were integral to the mind's nature, we could never hope to become more patient, right? We even have people that refer to themselves that way, right? I'm just an angry person. Anger is a part of my nature, right? And you can challenge them with this. Is it? But then you'd never have a moment of patience. You would never be able to develop the mind in terms of becoming more patient. And further, he says, if anger were a part of our minds, we would be getting rid of our minds at the same time that we rid ourselves of anger. To get rid of the anger because it's with our minds, we'd have to get rid of the whole thing. Just like you'd have to dump the whole glass of dirty water out to get anything. If you get rid of the dirt, you get rid of the water. No, we know that that's not really the nature of the water or of our minds. So then he says the disturbing attitudes and emotions, along with their imprints, prevent us from seeing both the clear light, conventional, and ultimate natures of our minds. Exalted beings see the reality of the mind in meditative equipoise. That's the ultimate nature. But during the subsequent period, the ultimate clear light nature of the mind is again obscured. This is the reality when you go into those states of mind of Aryas when they're in meditative equipoise directly on emptiness. That is all that is appearing to the mind, and they see it in its perfect state. They don't have any veils obscuring it whatsoever. When they come out of meditative equipoise into subsequent attainment, they no longer have that direct realization of emptiness, but they are able to understand phenomena very differently. But obviously, this will continue, this back and forth between knowing emptiness directly and not being able to be in that state and being in the subsequent attainment. That continues to be so until one attains enlightenment, when you no longer have any obscurations to seeing the two truths simultaneously. A little bit more on this. The conventional clear light nature of the mind, namely its clarity and cognizant nature, is seen by exalted beings in the period subsequent to the meditative equipoise on the ultimate clear light nature of the mind. In other words, they know the fundamental purity of the mind, even. Not just at the level of its emptiness, its ultimate nature, they know it even at the conventional nature, because they know they've begun the process of removing the obscuration. That is an evident truth to them as well. This conventional clear light nature of the mind can be perceived when the flow of thoughts which hides it is interrupted and discursive thought dies down. And even this state is difficult to achieve, he says. So again, I think that this was hopefully worth sharing a little bit because it gives a kind of another layer of appreciation for what we're talking about here. When we use this term clear light nature of the mind, we're mostly going to be referring to it as the ultimate nature of the mind, the emptiness of the mind. We can also depend upon the fact that the mind, by its conventional nature, is even free of those faults. Just, again, that is its nature, but it's still affected by them. And we're not saying that it is always going to be free of those, the same way that it is always empty of natural state, having that natural purity, that emptiness. But nonetheless, we can rely upon the fact that the mind is clear in nature, has the pure nature that is kind of the underpinning for everything that is rising within it. Again, I think this gives us an appreciation for the two main points that we're looking at with these 10 presentations and the 9 similes. That again, the adventitious nature of the defilements, that they're only there for the time being as a temporary disturbance to the minds. They can be removed because the mind is fundamentally pure, but also the emptiness of the mind, the clear light nature in the more ultimate state. So let's move into these 10 presentations now, because this again is where we're going to be for a little while. We've got several verses that pertain to this and quite a few pages of commentary. So to establish the Buddha nature beyond what we just did in verses 27 and 28, we're going to look at an extensive explanation. We're going to first, in topic A, establish the basic element to be pure by nature, by way of the 10 presentations. This is kind of, again, the clear light nature of the mind. We're going to primarily look at that as through the 10 presentations. B, establishing obscuration of the basic element, and this fact that it is defiled at the time stained by adventitious defilement through 9 similes. And that's going to be the next part of the text, a rather large chunk that we'll get to later on this year. Then C, the consciousness that perceives the basic element. That's one of the remaining topics after that, not very long section. And then finally, identifying the nature of the basic element. Those two will be there. And then again, we'll go on to look at the final topic, which is the purpose of this presentation. Again, Maitreya and Gyaltsab reiterating why this presentation is important. Okay, the 10 presentations. So we have a little link here coming in. Again, these links kind of bring us from the previous topic to this topic. And again, this is just a reference to Gyaltsab Je's text. This is the line beginning as a synopsis. So in verse 29, we get a kind of a laying out of all 10 presentations that we're going to go through. Nature, cause, result, function, possession, manifestation, state, and similarly, the meaning of all pervasiveness, immutability, and indivisibility of qualities are said to be the intended meaning of the ultimate basic element, of a kind of clear light nature of the mind. At the ultimate level, this is what we are referring to and kind of getting clear about through these 10 presentations. And we're going to go into nature next. That's the first of these. Nature refers to the Tathagata essence in its 3 aspects, the 3 we just discussed, right? So we're going to get them again yet in another presentation. And the manner of its division into those 3. Cause, the second presentation, refers to devotion and so forth, which are the causes for the activation and purification of the 3 aspects. So that by purifying our Buddha nature, we actually are able to become a Buddha then, the resultant state. Therefore, he says, these are causes that depend upon the 3 aspects and should not be held as causes that create the 3 aspects, right? The 3 aspects are what we are working with and in tandem with these causes to purify them, to be able to bring them to the culmination of the resultant state of Buddhahood. They are the causes, he says, for cleansing suchness of defilement and for the preparation and purification of the lineage. The result of this purification is the attainment of the Dharmakaya, which is the next topic, the third. As it says there, result refers to the fruit of attaining the perfection of purity and so forth, the 4 perfections that are set out in that presentation, and so forth, by the purification of the basic element through the practices of devotion and so forth. So numbers 2 and 3 are kind of in tandem, the causes for the purification and then the resultant purification that we achieve. And then there's a little comment in here. Isn't this the section that teaches the fruit of the basic element? Why the fruits of devotion and so forth? The 4 fruits of the practices of devotion and so forth are also the fruits of the basic element, because these 4 fruits arise from the purification of the basic element, which necessarily depends upon the practices of devotion and so forth. That'll become clearer when we get into it, but essentially these are kind of pointing to the same thing. You purify the basic element, you achieve the result, you engage in the causes, you will eventually receive this resultant perfections that are set out. Function. Function refers to the birth of renunciation that arises from seeing the faults of samsara, and to the generation of striving that arises from understanding the benefits of nirvana. These and others are activities that happen due to the existence of the lineage. Again, because our minds are subject to the influence of the Buddha's enlightened activities, we can develop renunciation and all the other qualities on the path. That's the function that it serves in terms of helping our mind to develop. That's the fourth of these 10 presentations. Possession refers to the possession of the four causal qualities, such as devotion and so on, and possession of the 7 resultant qualities, such as clairvoyance. And these are just qualities that one gains as one continues and developing the mind. Categories of manifestation, which is the 6th topic or 6th presentation, which are formed by the element's existence in different phases: the impure phase, the partially pure phase, and then finally the purified phase, refer to its entity in different categories. And then the remaining ones, numbers 7 through 10, states, all pervasiveness, immutability, and indivisibility of qualities, are ascertainments of the categories of manifestations, or kind of an extension of number 6. So we're going to see this when we get to them. I'm not going to spend time talking about them tonight. By the way, you have a wonderful set of charts in your materials that I'll be starting with tonight when we go through the first one, at least, the nature. So in its nature, it is undifferentiated, and it is only in certain states that it is differentiated. This is because one single nature is all pervasive in all states. Oh wait, I was going to skip this section. Yeah, this gets into some kind of stuff about, it's essentially referring to the fundamental nature that is the same throughout these different states that are set out as part of the remaining, the final topics. Let's just go right to this paragraph that summarizes this. These 10 should be known as the ascertainment of the meaning of ultimate element, which refers to the basic element taught in the sutras as the Tathagata essence. Through this, one will come to correctly understand the basic element. To summarize, this should be known as the presentation of the basic element of the Tathagatas based on the 10 points, and which is the sole object of the direct realization of the exalted wisdom consciousness. So again, a Buddha would be the only being that knows these all in their full nature, but nonetheless, we can study these and learn everything that is involved in kind of helping us to ascertain the meaning of the ultimate element, the naturally abiding Buddha nature that is the clear light nature of the mind. All right, so essentially, one thing I wanted to point out, I didn't go through this as yet, but I kind of alluded to a little bit, is that the 10 presentations then are primarily looking at, again, the clear light nature of the mind, the ultimate nature of the mind. And they're a presentation that helps us understand that aspect of it. It's not to say that we aren't going to touch on things involving the developmental lineage, because we will, because these two are inextricably bound up. The emptiness of the mind is together with the mind is together with its emptiness. So these two are going to be the main topics going forward. But we're primarily looking at, again, we saw this earlier, I think it was way back on page 57, when we saw this statement being made that Gyaltsab said, the mind not being ultimately defiled by the afflictions is the meaning of being in the nature of clear light. That's, again, the ultimate clear light that through Geshe Sonam's words, I introduced you to those, right? That essentially this is the main thing that is being set forth as the foundation for why it's possible to become a Buddha, because our minds are empty of inherent existence. Therefore, change is possible. Therefore, transformation is possible. But together with that is the mind that transforms. That is through the understanding that the afflictions are adventitious. They're like the dirt in the water. The nature of the water is clear and pure. The nature of our minds is clear and pure. That's the conventional nature. All we have to do is engage in the process of removing the dirt, removing all of the afflictions, kind of replacing it in a sense with all the qualities, because the qualities are how the dirt is removed, right? When we develop patience, we remove the dirt of anger. When we develop wisdom, we remove the dirt of ignorance. This is the process that we need to engage in. Remember, these are the two main things that are being emphasized in this text. Through the 10 presentations, we're going to be looking at the clear light nature of the mind, the ultimate nature of the mind. Through the 9 similes, we're going to be looking at the fact that the afflictions are adventitious. All of what obscures the mind is adventitious. I use this shorthand of afflictions. When I say that, know that I mean all of what obscures the mind. Because it's not just the afflictive obstructions, it's the knowledge obstructions and so on. All right, let me share a little bit from some PowerPoint slides that give you maybe another appreciation for this. This is from oral commentary by Geshe Tenzin Temple. He's one of the Geshes at Institute Lama Tsongkhapa. He was there as a brand new second Geshe. Geshe Delpa Gyatso was my main teacher in Italy at the master's program, but he's a wonderful teacher. He taught this topic in the basic program at Institute Lama Tsongkhapa. The Buddha lineage will be explained gradually as we proceed. In the explanation of the Buddha lineage in the commentary by Gyaltsab Je, there are two main approaches to understanding it. The 10 presentations, again, verse 29 through the first two lines of 96, and the 9 similes, verses 96 CD through 153. And there are some verses following that go through the remainder of this chapter. These two approaches have slightly different purposes. The 10 presentations establish the clear light nature of the mind, again, meaning its ultimate nature. The 9 similes establish the defilements or contaminations as being adventitious. That is, that they are not part of the nature of the mind and can therefore be eliminated. All right. So let me go ahead and go through this. I think it's fine maybe to go through this before we get into the text on this. We're going to have an introduction to nature and to cause. Well, actually, let's go back to the text. I'm sorry. Because there is this one's set out a little strange. Rather than just kind of going right into the first topic and doing the entire first topic and then going on to the second of the 10 presentations, instead we get this little introduction of both of these, nature and cause, together. It's kind of interesting because cause and result seem to be more closely aligned. But nonetheless, we're going to have nature and cause being presented together by Maitreya. So first we get a short presentation, a brief presentation of nature. This is in verse 30, the first two lines. Its nature is always unafflicted, like the purity of a jewel, again meaning a wish-fulfilling jewel, space, and water. So we're being given some similes for these three aspects that we just looked at in verse 27, all right? So this is in two parts, and this is what we're going to see with regard to many of these presentations. There's an analogy of like, this particular thing is like something else, or simile might be a better word for it. And then there's the significance of that. What is the meaning of that? Why do we compare the Dharmakaya to a jewel? Why do we compare the natural emptiness of the mind, the suchness of the mind, to space? Why do we compare the developmental lineage to water? Okay, so it says here, from the point of their individual characteristics, the three aspects are analogous to the wish-fulfilling jewel, space and water, respectively, while natural purity is a general characteristic of all three. We are going to see that there's sort of a individual characteristic for each of them, and then the general characteristic of all three is their natural purity, because everything is empty of inherent existence, folks. If you haven't gotten that yet, the Dharmakaya is empty of inherent existence. The suchness of our minds is empty of inherent existence. Our minds that are developing into Buddhahood are empty of inherent existence. So again, it goes on to delineate which of the three pertain to which of the three analogies. The Dharmakaya of the Tathagata is analogous to a wish-fulfilling jewel. Suchness is analogous to space, and lineage is analogous to pure water. By stating that the Dharmakaya here is a Dharmakaya emanating enlightened activities, it is not difficult to understand these enlightened activities as being capable of engaging with sentient beings. And this is why the Dharmakaya is compared to a wish-fulfilling jewel. However, he makes the point one more time again here. If it were teaching that the Dharmakaya itself was the basic element, the Tathagata essence, then the line, because the activities of the Dharmakaya are pervasive, would be unnecessary. That line's coming up. So again, we're just getting at this. Dharmakaya here is referring to the enlightened activities of the Buddhas that we receive, that we're the receptacle to receiving, and that we then have the potential to, give to others, to engage in with regard to others. Now we get an introduction of cause, and then we will go on to a more detailed explanation of each of these. Cause. It arises through devotion to the Dharma, the first of the four causes, supreme wisdom, second, samadhi, the third, and compassion, the fourth. From great devotion for the Mahayana, this deep faith in the Mahayana, which can be compared to a seed. And then the second, supreme wisdom, which can be compared to a mother. Then samadhi, which can be compared to a womb. And then compassion, which can be compared to a nurse. From higher wisdom, epitomized by the perfection of wisdom in the mind stream of the Bodhisattva, that's the second one. From the limitless gateways of the Bodhisattva's meditative concentration, that's the third. And from great compassion, the fourth. Suchness will be rid of all defilement. The lineage will be purified. And from this process of transformation, the Dharmakaya will arise. So again, we're going to see this in more detail, but we have 4 causes that are being, an analogy is made for each of them. And so we're going to line those up and we're going to see how those 4 actually act to remove 4 obstacles that we have to achieving Buddhahood. Let's go on to nature though, because this is the first and we did already introduce this. What I want to do to introduce nature a little bit further though is put on the screen. This chart is kind of hard to see in the Gompa here, maybe hard to even see at home. This is the chart that you have if you have, again, registered and have access to the materials. This is a set of charts. Let me go to this. It says here the charts from the FPMT basic program at Institute Lama Tsongkhapa. This is when Geshe Temple actually taught these at this ILTK in Italy. Okay, so this is the very first set of charts that have to do with the 10 presentations. I'm going to be depending upon these heavily as we go through these. So you'd be wise to maybe print out a copy because it sometimes is useful to make notes on them. What we see is that there are 5 columns to this. We have first in the first column, just the topic itself, the presentation, which is nature. And again, it mentions a verse, but that's where it's introduced and it doesn't delineate all of the verses where nature is taught. Then the second one is kind of the subdivisions in this case, the analogies that illustrate the individual characteristics, again, the 3 analogies that I mentioned a short while ago, then the general characteristics, and finally the short explanation. I'm going to start with the short explanation because I think it's good to talk about why is this being presented? Why are we getting another presentation of the nature? The presentation of nature, the chart says, shows that the defilements are not the nature of the mind. They are just adventitious and can therefore be removed from the mind. Now that sounds like what we were going to do by looking at the similes, right? As I said, don't think in totally strict terms that the 10 presentations are only about the ultimate clear light nature. They're also talking about, at times, how the defilements are there adventitiously. So they can be removed from the mind. First, the stains can be removed because they do not exist by their own nature. They are empty of inherent existence, therefore they can be changed. Next, because their mode of apprehension is not in accord with reality, the way that afflictions see things is not in accord with how they exist, because afflictions are always rooted in ignorance. The ignorance is always present when afflictions are there, distorting how things appear to us, or distorting how they're being apprehended by us. They appear to us as inherently existent, and we grasp at them, we apprehend them as if they're inherently existent. Then third, because the nature of the Dharmakaya, suchness and lineage are completely pure, because they're the fundamental purity, which again is really the ultimate clear light nature of things, is that all phenomena are empty of inherent existence. So we're looking at this presentation of nature just to ground us in that reality, that the nature of these things is that they are ultimately empty of inherent existence and that they are capable of therefore transforming through the removal of the adventitious defilements. So we have then the subdivisions, which are the same 3 that we saw in verse 27, set out in verse 31. The Dharmakaya, suchness, and the lineage. We have 3 analogies. For the Dharmakaya of a Buddha is like a wish-fulfilling jewel. Why? Because by interacting with sentient beings' minds, it fulfills all their hopes. Since this is the case, the Tathagata essence of sentient beings is a wish-fulfilling jewel too, because due to it, sentient beings can attain the Dharmakaya of a Buddha. As I said, that's kind of both sides of it. It's the objective side that sentient beings are capable of receiving those enlightened activities, and the subjective side that then we become a Buddha and are able to do that for others. And so it's kind of the circle of Buddhahood. 2, suchness. The suchness of the stained mind, suchness with stains, is like the space or sky. And we usually say space because space is actually a conceptual sort of construct. It's the absence of inherent existence. Space that we see, in a sense, like the space in this room, is composed space. This is what we often call uncompounded or uncomposed space, is the absence of obstructive contact. And again, it pervades everywhere because everything is without any sort of, wherever kind of space exists is an absence of unobstructed contact. But the idea is that it's a negation as well. We're negating that there is anything that obstructs in that allows space to be there in a sense. So emptiness too is a negation. So it's often used in this way as an analogy for emptiness. It says here, it's like space because it does not change due to causes and conditions. This is another way that it is similar. When we talk about uncompounded space, it's a permanent phenomenon. And there's always that negation. That negation doesn't change, even when things are occupying that space. We still would have what we can conceptually say is an absence of obstructive contact that allows things to be in those particular composed spaces. Again, and it's since it is in the mere negation of true existence, suchness is just as space is the mere negation of obstructive contact. All right, so this is again maybe a little hard to get our heads around, but suchness is being compared to space because of those qualities, because of space essentially not changing. It's a permanent phenomenon. When we talk about it being the absence of obstructive contact, and it is a negation, just like emptiness is a negation. The lineage, the analogy for the lineage, again, we divide lineage into two, as we've been discussing from the very beginning. Naturally abiding lineage or Buddha nature, the suchness of the stained mind, which is its supporting phenomenon that is suitable to transform into the nature body of a Buddha. Again, the nature body of a Buddha is the emptiness of a Buddha's mind together with the adventitious purity. Second, developmental lineage, the Buddha nature or Buddha lineage that is suitable to transform into the compounded bodies of a Buddha. Again, the form bodies as well as the wisdom truth body, the Jnana Dharmakaya. This latter one, again, not the first one, because we've already talked about the emptiness of the mind. The latter one, developmental lineage, which is the third of these three introduced in verse 27. The latter is like water. Why? Because it is moist with compassion for sentient beings. You know, they often say that kind of like water's whole thing is to allow a seed to develop, right? It allows it to grow and develop. It moistens everything so the process of growth can occur. Compassion and all these other qualities allow our minds to develop into Buddhahood. That's the developmental lineage. Okay, so those are the three that we're going to see when we get to the root verse. And again, there's not really that much to discuss when we get to that. The general characteristic is that they are naturally devoid of any affliction, right? The conventional clear light purity as well as the emptiness of inherent existence. These are the nature of all three of these. Okay, so now what does this verse teach? Verse 31, where these three are introduced. Because of having power, that's an interesting way of talking about the Dharmakaya, right? Being unchangeable and by nature moistened with compassion, it resembles the qualities of a precious jewel, space, and water. And these are what I just went through on the chart. The Dharmakaya of the Tathagata, the first of these three aspects or divisions, subdivisions of nature, possesses inconceivable power to accomplish all hopes and wishes. Therefore, sentient beings capable of receiving the enlightened activities of the Tathagatas also possess that power. Because we've got the objective power, the power to receive those teachings and utilize them to transform our mind into the Dharmakaya. Therefore, the second topic, suchness with defilement, too, does not change from its form of being empty by nature. At the stage of planting the seed, this is the third one, at the stage of planting the seed, the lineage that arises from proper appropriation, again, developmental lineage, it's a strange way of referring to it, but is in the form of compassion for sentient beings, as well as other qualities, but that's one of the main ones that allows our minds to be moistened and move in that direction of Buddhahood. Therefore, it is said to have the nature of being moist like water. In this way, these three aspects, by way of their individual characteristics, are analogous to a wish-fulfilling jewel, again, through having that power of the fulfilling the wishes of beings through their enlightened activities. Space, which again is same in its unchangeability as well as its negative quality and negation, and then the quality of water being moistened by compassion. In terms of a common characteristic, they are analogous to these three phenomena by way of their natural purity. All three of these being naturally pure, the wish-fulfilling jewel, space, and water. Okay, so then again, I don't often even want to go into detail about the commentary, but in this case I will, and then we'll take some time for our discussion and any questions. The short presentation of these three, which was taught by the lines beginning, because the perfect Buddha body emanates, begins from concerning these. All of these things in bold, by the way, these are from a Sangha's commentary. So we don't have that, thankfully, otherwise we'd have too much to go through. So it's just referring to where you're finding these in the Sangha's commentary. The extensive explanation says of their individual characteristics that one, in the Dharmakaya of the Tathagata, all hopes and wishes are accomplished, referring to all worldly and supramundane excellence. Two, concerning suchness, it is not to be transformed by causes and conditions, but like space, which does not change from its characteristic of being the mere negation of obstructive form, suchness too does not change from its characteristic of being the mere negation of the elaboration of true existence. In the causal state, when the mind is still defiled, and in the resultant state, when the mind is free of stain. Three, the Tathagata lineage, the Buddha lineage, developmental lineage, that arising, as it says here, from proper appropriation, exists upon the naturally abiding lineage, right? Because of the emptiness of the mind, then the mind can develop within that. If emptiness wasn't there, the mind couldn't change and develop. And just as water dwells in the nature of wetness, it is moistened by compassion for sentient beings. So just as the developmental lineage exists upon the naturally abiding lineage, water dwells upon the nature of wetness. So these allow for the moistness of the mind by compassion to occur. So by focusing on all sentient beings individually at different times, there's no sentient being who has not experienced the compassion of wishing others to be free of suffering. Therefore, all sentient beings have existed as objects of compassion and also as developers of compassion. Therefore, one's compassion generated for individual sentient beings when they are born as our friends and relatives, if it were not destroyed by opposing conditions such as anger, and if it were not separated from long-term conducive conditions, would develop into great compassion, which is a mind that focuses on all sentient beings at the same time, and whose mind is that it wishes for their separation from suffering. This is just delineating compassion from great compassion. Most of you know this, but essentially compassion is the wish for others to be free from suffering, or oneself even, if it's self-compassion. Great compassion is where we want to be the agent of doing that. It's taking responsibility for helping others to be free from suffering. However, because the conducive conditions are incomplete, he says, and because opposing conditions destroy it, it is mere compassion and should not be classified as great compassion. It is perfectly acceptable to categorize this type of compassion as a cause of great compassion. However, here, the lineage arising from correct adoption refers to the uncontaminated seed planted by listening to the sacred Dharma, and also to the great compassion of the Bodhisattvas, for example. That was just a deeper explanation of what we mean by compassion. In this case, looks like something happened to the Zoom room and folks are still, were exited and are coming back in somehow. I don't know, perhaps. Anyway, that's just delineating that although we say the term compassion, we're primarily meaning the great compassion that acts as the seed of awakening your Mahayana lineage and moving the mind in the direction of Buddhahood. So again, concerning general characteristics, it says here, they are always naturally devoid of any affliction, meaning that afflictions do not exist by their own nature. Their mode of apprehension is not in accord with reality. And by nature, these three are completely pure. They have ultimate clear nature in that they are empty of inherent existence. And there's the conventional nature of the mind that is pure and naturally devoid of any affliction. That's the entirety of the presentation of nature. I'd hoped to get to the presentation of cause at least started, but we'll start that with next week. So let me first see real briefly if there are any questions from anything I've talked about tonight, either online or in the podcast even. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Stephen's question was when we use the term ultimate clear light nature of the mind, as was on page 57 of the text that I cited earlier. I think at that point we were talking about the emptiness of the mind. And again, I mean, these two are bound up together, so it's kind of hard to talk about one without the other. But again, the clear light nature of the mind that is more conventional is the fact that the mind has that natural purity. Natural purity isn't the term I should use. It has a purity to it, that meaning that the stains in the mind do not reside within the mind in a way that contaminates it in a sort of fundamental way. The fundamental purity of the mind is there. But it's correlated with the emptiness of the mind. You can't really talk about one without the other to some degree. Sure. Yeah. When we talk about clear light, mind in Tantra, we're talking about something that's slightly different. I mean, it's still this deeper level of mind, this fundamental level of mind that is naturally pure. When we talk about developing an awareness of clear light in tantric practice, we are talking about getting to that place where that mind is manifest. And it's a different terminology then that we use for clear light, because it's also kind of, again, together with the wind energy of the mind at that level that kind of abide together in what we call the clear light mind. So clear light is used in both sutra and tantra with slightly different meaning. Right. Right. So Stephen's question is when we talk about the conventional clear light mind, as was spoken of by Geshe Sonam earlier, where is it essentially referring to that definition that we always use of the mind being clear and knowing? Yes. So when we talk about a definition of something, we're usually talking about its conventional nature, right? We say fire is clear, is hot and burning. We say mind is clear and knowing. This is a way of talking about it in its conventional nature. Because the ultimate nature of all things is the same. Everything is empty of inherent existence. So that is referring to its conventional clear light nature, that it is fundamentally pure in the way that water is clear and not in any way changed in its fundamental nature by virtue of dirt polluting. Okay. I know it gets to be very confusing because it's a lot of the same word. Remind me of the name again. Okay. Yes, please. Mhm. Mhm. Okay. The body's question is, of these three reasons that are being given and that we discussed in verse 27 and now in nature as well, what is the strongest of those that provides a foundation for the existence of Buddha nature? I don't know. I mean, they're all of great import and strength. Because if you look at it from the point of view of, again, if we said, let's just talk about, again, how a seed, let's use a completely conventional um, analogy, or let's use the acorn one. All right. So we have an acorn that can develop into an oak tree. All right. So when we say that the acorn has the ability to change and transform, that's an important part of it, right? Because if it couldn't change and transform, then it could never kind of move from the defiled and stained state that our minds are in to a purified state. It could never move from an acorn into an oak tree. It could never have that developmental component. But the only way that development is possible is because things lack inherent existence. Because if the acorn was inherently existent, or if our minds were inherently existent, then it would always be the way that it is. There would be no change possible. Because inherent existence means that the qualities reside inherent in the object from their own side and are established in that way. So there would be no changing of an acorn into an oak tree at all without the naturally abiding component of it, without the suchness, the emptiness. And our minds could never develop as well. But the first one, the Dharmakaya, is kind of like all of the causes and things that can be introduced from outside that help that process to develop, to go through that transformation. If there were no Buddhas in the world, if we were never able to receive their influencing activities in helping us to practice virtue and to know reality, which is the ultimate virtue, then would we ever do that transformation? No. So they're all three important, and they all three give validation to why it's possible for every one of us to develop our minds into that state. And again, I would encourage you when you meditate on something like this, which is part of the practice that I want you to do for this week, and it's in your kind of the sheet with the questions. It gives you some things to contemplate, is to really think about these three aspects and how they support your own ability to develop into the state of Buddhahood, as well as all others. Because obviously, when we develop the mind of bodhicitta, it has two components, right? May I become a Buddha to be able to help others to do the same. So we have to have conviction that it's possible for both ourselves and all other beings. So I don't know. Do you feel like there's one of them yourself that is more stronger as a reason? Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. So sure. Just for those at home, Badi's response was that the first two that I explained, the suchness of the mind, and then of course the developmental component, that those seem more inspiring and reasonable for her, and that it's hard to kind of prove that the Dharmakaya and its enlightening activities are the agents involved in all of this. But I find that's really an interesting one to contemplate. I mentioned it earlier, just to think about all the virtue that has ever happened in this world is due to the enlightened minds of Buddhas. Every virtue. I'll share something here, though. I really do want to give some time for discussion. When I saw His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Milan in 1999 with a very Catholic audience, they asked him, "Who is Jesus Christ in the eyes of Buddhism? Who is this being that appeared some 2,000 years ago, and what happened?" And His Holiness said, "Well, in Buddhist terms, because he had such a strong impact on the morality and good behavior of so many people in this world, he would have to be a high-level bodhisattva, if not a Buddha." You know, so at some level, you kind of get this kind of goosebump feeling, like everything that's happened in the world is the enlightened activities of the Buddhas, whether they call it Jesus Christ, or they call it Muhammad, or they call it, Krishna, or they call it whoever. It's the enlightened activities of the Buddha. Because even if it's just sentient beings like myself teaching on this topic, it's through the force of those beings that we have these teachings to give, or any teachings to give on good morality, concentration, wisdom, whatever the topic may be. So it's an interesting one to think about, how we are subject to those influences and of all around us, through various forces. And it's all part of the process. None of it's divorced from, I don't know. Again, it's a pretty mind-blowing exercise. But let's take a little bit of time now for some discussion. If you still have some questions, please jot them down. You'll get a chance to ask them either later, or you can send them to me and I'll answer them at another point. Let me see if I can get things to appear so I can put them on the screen. My little menu, you can't see this again from your vantage point, but it keeps not wanting to appear. Let me get rid of these. That'll help. Yeah, there we go. Okay, these are the questions that came from last week, and you're welcome to discuss them. If you'd like to kind of go reviewing what we did last week, if that was the main, I don't know, kind of topic that you'd like to pursue in the discussion. How I presented the meaning of refuge. Again, there was a chart for that you all have. The meaning of jewel, that was on the other side of the chart. And then we had these four aspects that were inconceivable that I went through very briefly at the beginning of tonight. So again, know that that's something that you can do certainly with this time, is just basically review what's all on that chart, as well as these four aspects and the way that they are very difficult to ascertain. If you're more inclined to discuss what we did tonight, and again, I'll leave that to each group to decide, then you can certainly look at verse 27 and 28 in this first presentation and discuss these three. And again, the last question had to do with cause because I haven't gotten to that yet. And certainly, but again, you follow these questions if you wish. But if the conversation starts going into one thing in more depth, that's perfectly fine to, pursue that. So again, if all the folks who are remaining in the Zoom room would go ahead and form a discussion group, and then those in the Rampa here can form 1 or 2 groups. All right, we'll come back in maybe like 15 minutes, and then we'll just have a brief recap. Okay, so 15 minutes discussion.